Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. As many of you know, I enjoy speaking to fellow ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. On this occasion, I am honored to welcome onto the channel a veteran ex-Jehovah's Witness activist, Alan Feuerbacher. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Nice to see you on this venue.
It's really special that you reached out to the channel, and we've been in touch off and on over the years. I've actually cited your material once or twice in my videos because you have quite an impressive body of work when it comes to debunking various cultic nonsense that's come out of Jehovah's Witnesses over the years. Before we kind of get stuck in, for how long would you say you've been involved in activism of varying degrees?
About 30 years.
Sure. So we're talking decades, and I'm literally celebrating my first decade as an activist this year. So you help put things in perspective. So thank you very much. Okay, well, it would help, I suppose, to understand how you first came to be involved with Jehovah's Witnesses. So how did they make a foothold in your life?
Well, according to some people in my family on my mother's side, a shirt-tail relative of my great-grandmother met up with the Bible students back in the late, around 1908, 1909. And after going to a meeting with them, he came back and he told his wife, "I've found the truth." And then shortly after that, he died. Nothing came of any of that. Then must have been around 1917, 18, my paternal grandfather, living in a rural Oklahoma town, defended a coal porter, a Bible student coal porter, they called it back then, with a shotgun. And the local townspeople wanted to, they got hold of him and they tarred and feathered him. And then they let him loose, and this guy managed to make it to my grandparents' home. And my grandpa didn't like the fact that that he was being abused so badly, so he defended him. And then several years later, I believe it was 1920, Grandma joined the Bible students. Grandpa never did, but she became one of the anointed over time in the usual way. And then they had 11 kids, and so all of them became witnesses. I should say most of them did, at least off and on. And then on my mother's side, fast forward 20 years from the 1900s, early 30s, I guess it was, one great aunt got involved with the witnesses shortly after they renamed themselves Jehovah's Witnesses. And then she got all of the rest of the family, I should say most of the rest of the family, involved with the Bible students or the witnesses. And it just went on from there. So then my father, when he got to be about 18 years old, I believe, he went to California to make his fortune. And then for reasons I was never clear on, he ended up going to Bethel. That was 1938. And he stayed there for another 8 years. And he ended up in the correspondence department, which eventually became the service department. And so he did a lot of responding to mail coming in from people. And he ended up knowing all of the bigwigs in Bethel, Rutherford, Knorr, Franz, some of the some of the men who in the 1990s became president and vice president of the various Watchtower corporations. And I guess he was a pretty competent, smart guy. But then long about 1946, he met my mom. My mom's mom was in the habit at that time of entertaining Bethel boys, as they called them back then, because they lived about 45-minute drive from Bethel on Long Island. And so she would entertain Bethel boys, feed them a meal on the weekends, and they'd associate with some of the young folks in a congregation. So my mom and dad met 5 years later in 1951. I was born, and of course, my dad by that time became the congregation servant, and was pretty active until his health failed in the early 60s.
So probably I should mention, for those who aren't familiar with the various nuances of Watchtower history, there was a period, wasn't there, where there weren't bodies of elders because Rutherford hated elders. He saw them as a threat to his authority. So he ended up getting rid of the elder arrangement, which had been instituted under Charles Taze Russell, and switching to a congregation servant, effectively a pastor for the congregation, who communicated directly with the organization right up until the 1970s, when they switched back to the elder arrangement.
That's right. And in the earlier days of that, the men were called company servants. And somewhere in the early 50s, they changed that to congregation servants. And these guys had pretty much absolute power over the congregation. I remember, it must have been about 1958, when I was about 7 years old. Nathan Knorr and his sidekick George Couch, who became ultimately the personnel director of Bethel, they came over to our house and they appointed my dad to go to a local congregation and straighten it out. I don't know what the problems were, but the elders, call them elders, the servants there were a bunch of dopes, I guess. And my dad got it all, working well. And after that, his health failed, and he more or less became inactive. And, that was in my teen years. So after that, I got baptized in 1967, just short of my 16th birthday. And after that, well, that's a whole nother story of my getting out of the witnesses.
Well, and a story I'd love to hear. I mean, you are born into a very, you would call it a rich spiritual heritage, is the terminology they would use today. You had good pedigree in terms of, carrying on the baton, as it were, and following in your father's footsteps. Why didn't you?
Well, it's a little hard to say. I've often thought about that. I think for one thing, I was always more concerned with factual matters, the truth of things, than most other witnesses I knew or knew of. For example, a few months after I was baptized, when I was just barely 16, the society came out with its ban on organ transplants, and this was in 1967. And I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. Organ transplants being the equivalent of cannibalism. I remember one phrase in a Watchtower or Wake magazine that it was having a transplant was the same as cutting up the organ and chewing it and swallowing it. Same thing. And I had an argument with my dad about that, and he thought it was a great idea. I thought it was just plain stupid. So, of course, at age 16, there's nothing that I could do, and I just sort of, let it slide and went on with my life. And ultimately, there were a whole bunch of different things that happened that made me not trust the society. For example, I know you may or may not know about this, but I think it was 1971. They decided that the physical heart, rather than the brain, was the seat of human emotions, and so they had a district assembly. I remember going to Yankee Stadium that year, and at the assembly they had on stage a giant green brain on one side and a giant red heart on the other, and the two of them engaged in a dialogue, as if the brain was the logical side and the heart was the emotional side. So they're going back and forth, talking to one another and coming to a decision. And again, it was one of the most stupid things I can remember. I remember I was going out in service with a pioneer partner, and we went to a door, and he started trying to tell the guy at the door about this article, and the guy looked at him like he had two heads. What? The brain and the heart talking to one another? And I just kind of backed off. I literally backed away and tried to back down the steps, And anyway, so that was one of the things that made me, again, not trust what the Watchtower said.
Yeah, they've, at least as far as long as I've known, and it's interesting to hear your perspective as someone who knew the organization much, much earlier than really when I was born in 1979. As long as I've known, the organization has been fanatical in taking the Bible literally. So if the Bible says something, even if it can be disproven, this is what we're going to stick to, because probably whatever evidence is going against the Bible will itself be disproven eventually. The Bible must be true. So it sounds like they were just fixating over words at that point in their history, and yet doubling down really on stuff that is easily debunked.
Sure. And I learned later that much of this nonsense that came out during those years was from Fred Franz. He was the author of the blood policy, blood transfusion ban, for example, in the 1940s.
I've heard people say that, but are you able? Where does this come from? I've heard people say that Fred Franz originated the blood ban, but I've never seen anything that kind of categorically confirms it. Is this something that we're able to confirm, or is it just kind of like a word of mouth thing?
Well, it's something that I figured out, and other people who figured it out have confirmed. For example, Barbara Anderson. I've had many discussions with her about these things. She's confirmed it. There was a former district overseer who was in Bethel in the 1950s, and he was sort of an adjunct to the New World Translation Committee, kind of a gopher, but he was a brilliant guy, and he knew all the guys who were on that committee. So he was a source of information about some of these things. And another thing was, you got to remember that back in the 40s, after Rutherford died, Fred Franz became, as Ray Franz said, the oracle of the organization. So whatever he came up with became the theological teachings of the Watchtower, and Knorr just kind of went along with it because he was the businessman. He didn't give a hoot about the teachings, really, for the most part. But if you read the publications from the beginning in the 1940s, you can get a flavor for a voice, a writer's voice. And that was largely Fred Franz. And that continued on through all of the, well, really until he quit writing, I guess, in the early 80s. And I mean, you can see that in those, what they called the bound books, what is it, 384 page books that were produced from the 40s up through, well, really through the 70s. The voice of Fred Franz comes through loud and clear.
Was there a bit of Fred Franz in the Revelation Climax book? Because that had quite a distinct language to it. Lots of and lo and, you know, just superfluous words, you know, and, or maybe the writers were influenced themselves by what they'd read from Fred Franz. I know he was getting on a bit by then.
Yeah, I think that was it, because I think he died. He was close to 100 years old. I don't remember exactly when he died in the early 90s. So he didn't have much to do with that. He was blind and, you know, half demented by that time anyway. But he had a tremendous influence on the rest of the organization. You know, I mean, most of the Watchtower, I'll call them thinkers in air quotes, were influenced by him, trained by him.
So, you know, you've mentioned a number of kind of stumbling blocks, for want of a better expression, that kind of steered you towards thinking that, you know, this organization may not be a font of divine wisdom. Was there kind of a line in the sand where you realized you needed to part ways, or was it more of a gradual process?
It was a very gradual process. For example, I'm trying to think of what the some of the significant milestones were in that. All right, in 1975, I got married, and 1975, of course, as the end of the world, Armageddon fell through, and I was sort of shell shocked at the time. Not that I said to myself, "Hey, I'm really bothered by this." It didn't work that way. But over a period of several years, I got very antsy as I started thinking, well, what is it going to be like in 20, 30, 40 years when the world is still around and nothing that the society has predicted has happened? And so several people who were not witnesses I talked to, you know, kind of about that in kind of general senses, and they urged me to think about going to college. My father-in-law at the time was not, well, he was never a witness, but he encouraged me to think about going to college. So I talked to my wife about it, and she was willing for us to spend the 4 years. And so I entered college in 1978, got out 4 years later. Well, I went to a community college my first year because I had been out of high school for 9 years, and I didn't know if I could take the college pace and all that stuff. So I figured, okay, I'll gradually dip my feet into the college scene and see if it worked. Well, I did pretty well, and then was able to transfer to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in 1979. And I graduated from there in 82 with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. So I had to take some humanities courses while there. I took an anthropology course, and this was, spring of 1980. And for the course, I had to write a term paper on some subject of interest related to anthropology. So I decided, well, let's see if I can dig up bunch of research information proving that the Tower of Babel was the origin of human languages, because everything spread out from there. And so I started looking in the Watchtower publications, found out that virtually none of the source references that they gave were usable, because either they didn't prove the point, or in some cases they were just flat out misrepresented. So by this time, a month had gone by in my 3-month allotment of time to write this paper. So I decided to do a similar thing with the creation evolution issue. Well, of course, I found exactly the same thing, but by the time I found this out, I only had a month left, and I realized that I had to do something in order not to fail the course. So I found a book in the library that was written by a creationist of some sort, but lo and behold, unlike most creationists, he actually had some reasonable arguments, reasonable in the sense that they weren't out and out misrepresentations of scientific literature. Well, as a result of that research, one of the things that I did was look into the notion that there were millions of quick frozen mammoths and other animals in Siberia and Alaska. And actually, I have to back up a little bit. When I first got to MIT, that was on my mind. I don't remember why, but it was. And so in the time between moving to...
Just in case anyone's wondering why you would have millions of quick frozen mammoths on your mind, it's to do with Noah's flood. So
it was all Noah's flood.
The organization would point to any discovery of a mammoth in permafrost as evidence that this must only have been caused by a sudden inundation of water, accompanied by freezing.
Yeah, and by the way, I've written extensively on that, and it's all complete nonsense.
Yeah.
So, so I when I first got to MIT, I was wondering about that. So I went to several the offices of several geology professors, and I wanted to find out if they had anything to say about this, and they looked at me like, "Are you kidding? There's not. Where do you get these ideas?" And so I was quickly disabused of the notion that there was any such thing. And the reason, of course, that I wanted to talk to them was that I thought, wow, if this is such strong evidence for Noah's flood, it must be common knowledge in the geological community. No, there's nothing like that. And anyway, so one of the things that I did was, as part of this research, was to look up some of the source references in Watchtower literature to this business of frozen mammoths. And one of the source references was to an article in a 1903 Smithsonian institution annal, where the discovery of the famous Beresovka Siberian mammoth was documented. It had been discovered in 1899 in eastern Siberia, and the Moscow scientists dispatched an expedition to go dig the thing up. After several years, they managed to do that, bring it back to Moscow, and it eventually ended up as kind of stuffed in a museum in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, I guess. Anyway, the article was close to 100 pages, I believe, and the Watchtower quoted from it about about some of the frozen remains, and it took a picture from that Smithsonian journal. And that picture has appeared many times in Watchtower literature from, I believe, the late 40s onward. And it said, oh, this thing was, had died with food in its mouth, where it was in the process of chewing the food when it was suddenly killed with no sign of violence, and yada, yada. And anyway, turned out that every single thing that the Watchtower claimed was refuted by the article that they themselves had quoted. So, of course, I couldn't use that in my creation evolution paper because it touched on the flood as a matter of necessity. And anyway, long and the short of that was that after that experience, I didn't believe much of anything the Watchtower wrote on any topic whatsoever. So
you went into that process wanting to defend creationism.
Right. And actually, it's kind of funny looking back on it, because I finished the paper, and the professor literally didn't know what to do with it, because I guess I did a pretty good job of writing it, but because the basic information was nonsense. The only
it's like, why unicorns aren't real? It's like, is this really needed?
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, it took him about 6 months after the course was over for him to give me a grade. He gave me a B on it, and then we discussed a little bit of stuff. But I could see he was really walking on eggshells, because here he was dealing with a bright creationist who was just completely deceived. So anyway, he just kind of washed his hands of it. And then I took that in, and I realized, wow, I had made a complete fool of myself. Anyway, so then later on, in terms of my journey out of the witnesses, when I got out of college in '82, we moved to Oregon, where I'd got a good job with an electronics company. And I didn't really think very much about the witnesses. Then we joined the local congregation, which didn't last for me but another year and a half, because I remember getting really, really disgusted with the things the Watchtower organization was coming out with. And it led to my basically saying, I'm done with this. I'm not going out in service anymore. I'm not going to meetings anymore. Yada, yada, yada. So that was in late 1983. And after that, I just kind of washed my hands of the whole thing, except that I was still very interested in the ideas of about Noah's flood. Was there actually any geological evidence in favor of it? Long story short, as you know, there is none. Everything that the witnesses and other creationists come up with is just, it's misrepresentations and misinterpretations of the actual evidence. So I remember one time in 1986, we traveled back east to New York to visit family, and while there, I met up with a fellow who I had met at MIT. He was a young freshman. He was 18 years old at the time we met. Very, very intelligent Jewish boy from Manhattan. And he had somehow gotten involved with the witnesses and with a local girl there. And they ended up getting married and living in New Hampshire. So at that time in '86, I visited with my then wife, and I visited them, and I talked to him about my misgivings about Noah's flood. So he said that there was an article floating around the witness community there that had been written by a studious witness about Noah's flood, and trying to show that there were no ice ages and all sorts of nonsense like that. And so he gave me the address of the guy who wrote it. So I wrote him. A while later, he wrote back and he said, well, I hate to tell you this, but everything that I wrote in that paper is like 100-page paper. Everything is obsolete because the society abandoned this stuff a few years ago. I thought,
abandoned what stuff?
On saying that there were no ice ages, that all of the evidence for ice ages was really evidence for Noah's flood. So that really, really bothered me because I realized, well, the society never informed the witness community about that. All the people that I knew, including myself, were going on what had been written for the previous 20 some odd years. You know, there's no glaciation. It's all flood evidence and so on. And most witnesses, of course, don't give two hoots about this, but I did because, you know, it was a fundamental piece of physical evidence for my religious faith. So anyway, when I learned that the society had changed that, I was quite upset. But of course, what am I going to do? There's nothing I could do. I had already learned by that time that writing to them about any of this kind of stuff got either no response or dismissal, a very dismissive response. So I kind of left matters as let matters sit for a few years later until my then wife wanted me to try to talk to a young local elder about some of these things, and so I did for about a year, and of course he had no idea what was going on about any of this stuff. So he this was kind of funny. He asked me if I was willing to talk to a circuit overseer about this. So this guy, his name was Don Amy. He came over and we started talking about some of the things. And I said, you know, the vapor canopy idea, I think, is physically impossible. Of course, I was much more circumspect talking to him than I am to you about this. Yeah. And he says, well, maybe I said it's physically impossible for such a thing. And he said, well, maybe the water was in orbit. And I said, in orbit, that's physically impossible because the only place that a big shell of water that was in orbit could stay in orbit would be around its equator of rotation. At the poles, it would immediately fall down. And he looked at me with like deer in the headlights stare, and he had no idea what I was talking about. And I mean, this is typical for circuit overseers. I mean, they come up through the ranks as pioneers. They have no science education whatsoever. They have, you know, they're lucky to have an 8th grade education, I think, in some cases. So anyway, after that was done, this young brother who couldn't tell me anything encouraged me to write to the society about this. And I thought, well, okay, I guess I'll try it. So I thought I'll put together maybe 30 pages of text about my misgivings about the flood and the physical evidence. And it ended up that by the time I finished, after about a year of this, I had 150 pages compiled. And I realized they're not going to ever look at this. So mid-1992, I had finished up this paper, and I was talking to this friend at work, And he said, "Hey, do you realize that there's a discussion going on about that book on Usenet news groups?" I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." So he explained what Usenet was, and what news groups were, and all that stuff.
When you say a discussion about that book, which book are we talking about?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was the 1985 creation book.
Oh, okay.
There was a lot of argumentation going on. So anyway, so I dived into that, and there were two news groups where these discussions were going on. And just so people know, Usenet news groups were sort of like specialized email lists where you would post something to a news group and it would be distributed to hundreds or thousands of users who subscribe to that topic. And if you wanted to, you could reply to it. So there were two interesting ones that I got involved with. One was called talk.origins, and another one was called talk.religion.miscellaneous. So,
and this was online, was it?
Oh yeah, this was online.
Because this would have been, the early 1990s. So I can imagine it being quite a different experience to online activism today.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's basically like getting an email and replying to it, except that the email was distributed to thousands of users.
Okay.
The stuff can be that it can be found to this day through the Internet archives. Anyway.
So there's a conversation going on these early online groups about the creation book, and
Correct.
you've already had a crack at writing a letter, which you kind of realized isn't going to be read because it's number one, very long, and number two, critical of the organization's teaching. So how did you see yourself fitting into this conversation? Well,
I quickly became a vocal critic. And whenever a witness would come up with the usual ridiculous rationalization, I would explain why it was wrong. And I posted very long explanations of why it was wrong, along with source references and so on. And of course, none of the witnesses could actually provide any refutations of what I said, just the usual sort of blanket dismissals. So anyway, after I got involved with that, I thought, okay, now I know that the society is completely screwy in terms of anything to do with science. So what about anything to do with religious topics? So I went to about the same time, I guess, mid-1992, I went to a local religious bookstore, and I found a couple of books that looked to be of interest. And one of them was called Witnesses of Jehovah. It was written by a couple of...
I've got that book. I'm looking at it now on my bookshelf. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was written by a couple of ex-witnesses who had become evangelicals, and they wrote what I now realize is very much a brief summary of many of the things that were wrong with the witness teachings. Of course, they were Trinitarians and so on, so they had that perspective. And but in that book, I learned about a lot of different things. Like I didn't know that there was such a set of books called Watchtower Reprints. And I don't know if, well, there's probably a lot of people to this day that don't know what Watchtower Reprints are. But in 1919, the society had its staff compile.
This is one of them.
Yeah, there you go.
For the benefit of viewers, this is the first of the Watchtower reprints for the very first. I don't think it's showing up well on camera, sorry, but this is the first bunch of Watchtowers published from 1879 onwards, reprinted in circa 1919, 1920.
So anyway, ultimately I got hold of a set of them. It took me a few years, but I did get a set. Anyway, I learned about that. I also learned about Carl Olaf Johnson and his work on the Gentile Times and the 607 stuff. I got hold of his book, and then eventually got in touch with him, and we corresponded for some years quite fruitfully. And anyway, in the course of doing all these things, I met a whole lot of very interesting, competent people. Like, have you ever heard of Richard Rowie?
Yes, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Richard lived in Washington State, in a little town called Soap Lake. And Richard was one of those amazing, I'll call them diggers up of information that most people would never take the time or effort to find. So he had an incredible collection of old material from Russell's days. So I visited him at his home several times, and we had a very fruitful relationship, looking for information, and mostly me learning from him. So anyway, after several years of this stuff, I started taking a look at my own beliefs. And to make a long story short, I realized that I didn't believe in God anymore. I accepted evolution based on the scientific evidence, and I for some years I thought of myself as an agnostic. It's not that I disbelieved in any gods, I should say in the Bible God, but I didn't believe either. So that's pretty much the definition of an agnostic. And eventually, after Richard Dawkins published his book, The God Delusion, I realized that attitude that I had was really the definition of being an atheist. So since then, I realized, yeah, well, I do not believe in any gods, so that makes me an atheist. It's not that I can prove that no gods exist, but I don't believe in them because there's no evidence for them any more than there is evidence for the tooth fairy. Mm. So you could call me an tooth fairyist by the same token.
Do you feel that position that you came to put you at odds with other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses?
Oh yeah. Most of them don't really know quite what to do with it, because if you just say you don't believe in the God of the Bible, the society has never given them any real defense against that. They can come up with some rationalizations, but nothing that approximates a rational discussion. Mm. But what really got me on the outs with some witnesses, including my parents, was my relationship with Barbara Anderson and being an activist in the community that exposes the Watchtower's screw ups in terms of handling sexual abuse cases. So I guess this might be of interest to some people, but Barbara has known me since I was 3 years old in the early 50s. She became a witness at age 14, and happened to be in the congregation that my parents went to, where my dad was the congregation servant. So my mom kind of took her under her wing. She was about 10 years older than Barbara. And over a period of time, Barbara married her husband, Joe, and they went off and became pioneers and missionaries, and eventually ended up in Bethel. And my mom and eventually my stepdad, which is a whole nother story, but they were all fast friends for quite a few years, until Barbara left Bethel and then left the Witnesses, and made it explicit in 1997 that she was not really a witness anymore. My mom basically cut her off. So around that time, for reasons I won't go into, I hooked up with Barbara again, and we became fast friends. And so in the next few years, we did quite a few things together. She working in the foreground, and me doing a few little things in the background to help her out with her projects. And my parents, I guess it was around, well, it was shortly after the Dateline program that made the fat hit the fan, as some people would say. My parents realized that Barbara had been instrumental in the Dateline program, and that I had helped out. So they disowned me and they cut me off, and basically declared me an apostate, and they would have nothing to do with me. So that was the end of that relationship. And about 10 years ago, my stepdad died. He was a much loved elder, by the way. And then my mom went on, and now she's in her mid-90s, and basically has dementia, so she has no idea what's going on.
So from the point where they cut you off, that was it? You never had any contact with them again, right?
Yeah, that was it. I had an interesting discussion with my stepdad shortly after the Dateline program aired, and he and Mom had written me a letter saying, we're cutting you off. So I called him on the phone, and I said, I'd like to get your comments on a few things that I think are facts about this business. And I said, are you aware that governing body member Leo Greenlees was a homosexual pedophile? And he hadn't heard of that. So I explained the situation, and he couldn't really refute it, but he didn't quite believe it. So several weeks later, I called him back, and by that time, he had confirmed with his Bethel friends. Might have been Albert Schroeder, for all I know, because they had been friendly on a social basis. He had confirmed that Greenlees was, in fact, booted out of Bethel for being a homosexual pedophile. And I said, why didn't the society disfellowship this guy? Well, I don't know. Well, I later learned that through Ray Franz and others, that the basic reason was that the society didn't want to have a public scandal. Anyway, can
I just say, just for the purpose of clarity, because I kind of take the factual element of the channel very seriously. There's a lot of strong anecdotal evidence that everything that you've said is the case, but obviously there's nothing in writing. And this was very frustrating for me when I was researching this to begin with. You want some kind of documented, ironclad, irrefutable evidence to prove that this is the case. But everything that I found online And I'm not disputing that what you've said is true. I'm just saying that it's not like we can point to a letter that was issued by Watchtower saying that, oh, yes, this is the reason why he was ejected from the governing body. It's very much a word of mouth situation, which is very plausible, but nonetheless not something that we can necessarily pin down with documented evidence.
No, you're absolutely right. Believe me, if I had that evidence, it would be in the hands of news organizations.
Yeah.
It would have been in there long ago. I can say this, that I have confirmed with 2 Bethel officials that this was indeed the case, but one of them remained anonymous to me, but not to a mutual friend. And the other one was somebody with whom I formed, I'll call it a good at arm's length relationship. And I'm not about to release his name because I don't want him to get in trouble. He's still a witness, by the way, after all this, but I don't want to get him in any kind of hot water. If he died, I'd say his name. But
so you had this conversation nonetheless with your father, and just so the viewers know, the Dateline documentary aired in 2002. Simultaneously, almost, there was a Panorama documentary in the UK called "Suffer the Little Children," also airing in 2002, and this was really the first major exposure of the mishandling of child sexual abuse by Jehovah's Witnesses. So this was what you were confronting really your stepfather about, but it sounds like you didn't really get anywhere.
No, because he was one of these witnesses who says, my basic reference is the Bible. But as with most witnesses, it really wasn't. His basic reference was the Watchtower, the society. So I on one of those final phone calls, I confronted him with that, and I said, I said, you were a World War II prisoner of war, so you know what war is all about from personal experience. I said, one of the things that people who are patriots, which you obviously were and are no longer, one of the things that patriots like to say is that is along the lines of my country, right or wrong. I think the longer quote is something like, my country, may it always be in the right, but right or wrong, my country. And I said, well, if you substitute my religion for my country, I said, that's obviously your attitude, because you can dismiss the fact that a governing body member, supposedly appointed by Holy Spirit to be on the governing body, Leo Greenlees, was a homosexual pedophilia when he was appointed. And that doesn't bother you. Why doesn't it bother you? And he just kind of hummed and hawed and couldn't say anything, of course, because they can't.
Yeah. So one thing I do want to kind of take you back to is you mentioned about 1975, and obviously there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. I was actually born after 1975, so I obviously can't remember anything about it. But, I think it's important to document what happened then for the current generation and for future generations. So, from your perspective, is it all a storm in a teacup? Was it a case of individual rogue Jehovah's Witnesses getting the wrong end of the stick? Or was this a teaching that came directly from the organization and was pushed with a degree of certainty?
Well, mostly the latter. And I've done a lot of research on that. And the long and the short of it is, I know from personal experience what the attitude in the organization was at the time from 1967 onward. And yeah, they pushed it. They didn't say, of course, Armageddon will come in 1975. They were a little too cagey for that, but they said everything else but. And I've documented that in in material that's on my website, which I've given you the links for. And that stuff is it's unequivocal what they said. I mean, just as an example, I remember back in 1968, we had a circuit servant visit. His name was Anthony Conti. He was a real cool guy, as circuit servants went. Circuit servant, they're now called circuit overseers, but I'm going back to the 60s. So he gave a talk based on a Kingdom Ministry article where he basically said, brothers, do you know that in just 88 months, 1975 will be here? And do you know what that means? Well, the society has told us what it means. And of course, he never came out and flat out said Armageddon will be here, but it was, all this wink, wink kind of stuff. And everybody knew exactly what he meant. And so, that literally electrified me. I sat up and took notice like never before, and I became much more enthusiastic about preaching and all that stuff. And I was only 17 at that point. So, when people tell me that, it was individual Jehovah's Witnesses that exaggerated what the society said, bullpucky. I know what I was told. And kids who are 16, 17 years old, they don't come up with that kind of nonsense on their own. So anyway, if you look in, for example, the Kingdom Ministries from that time on, which you can't even get in the Watchtower publications because they didn't publish anything on the Watchtower library, the CD-ROM library, after or before 1970. But I've got all of them, and I went through them page by page, so I know what they said, and that's documented in several write-ups on my website.
Yeah, we'll get to your website shortly, because I want to. I think the body of work you've assembled over many years is incredibly valuable, and I've pointed my viewers specifically to. I'm thinking your debunking of the creation book as a wonderful resource, because you're demonstrating how even from the first few pages of that book, they're immediately straight out of the gate. I think Charles Darwin gets misquoted.
Yep.
So it's a really, really useful resource. And I want to kind of make sure viewers know exactly where to find all of that material. But before we wrap up, I'm interested to get your perspective, kind of activist to activist, because, again, I'm coming up on 10 years. You've been at this 30 years. If you could sum up how ex-Jehovah's Witness activism has changed over 30 years, how would you do that?
Well, I was involved for 20 years with a bunch of people who, what I would say, laid the foundation in the computer world for debunking much of Watchtower teaching and exposing their vile and dishonest practices. Of course, before that, there were many people who did the same thing, but in print for decades before. I could name names, but most people these days wouldn't have knowledge of them. anyway, I would say that by roughly a decade ago, all that information had been pretty thoroughly documented. And so I and others relaxed. And I consciously decided that I would let others take up the gauntlet. People like you and the J.W. Facts guy and Barbara Anderson and a whole bunch of other fine people, because they do an excellent job. So if what they can do is use some of the existing computerized information as a basis for modern criticisms of the Watchtower organization, I think that's a pretty good basis for them to go on, because it's all documented. It's all you have to do is get hold of the original Watchtower literature, and it's there. Of course, that's not necessarily such an easy thing, as you well know.
I think you very kindly merged some of your collection with mine. As I recall, you sent me a whole bunch of Rutherford booklets that got
Correct.
merged with my collection. So I'm very grateful to you for that. But yeah, it's very important that, well, the way I think of it is standing on the shoulders of giants. My work over the years would have been so much more difficult if there hadn't been the Gentile Times Reconsidered by Carl Olof Jonsson, if there hadn't been Crisis of Conscience, if there hadn't been the work you'd been putting in, if we'd have had to just completely start from scratch in building, coherent, logical evidence against organization, it would have been so much more difficult. But to have you, Jim Penton, Ray Franz, to have all of these who had, just laid the information out in such an easily understandable way, made everything so much easier for my generation, and I'm sure in turn for future generations. I'm kind of hoping at some point I'll reach the stage where I could just fold my hands and watch the younger generation have at it. I guess I'm a few years away from that, but it's just lovely to connect with you and be able to thank you personally for your contribution, which is considerable. Well,
I'm looking back, I'm happy to have done it. It's very satisfying because, you look at the Watchtower organization and from a philosophical standpoint, and what are they? They're a bunch of amateur Bible expositors whose organization was founded by an amateur, and you can see the amateurishness in all their writings, in their research, in their supposed logic, pretty much everything they do. As far as I'm concerned, and people will disagree with me on this, the only thing that they've ever done that's really not completely amateurish is the New World Translation. And the reason I say that is that I've done a lot of looking up criticisms from various quarters of the New World Translation. And it turns out that in my opinion, the majority of criticisms are either trivial or just a matter of doctrinal interpretation. That said, there are places where Fred Franz clearly translated things wrong in order to support some pre-existing Watchtower doctrine. And I've documented these things in various places. But in terms of a readable, reasonably accurate, not completely, translation, I think the 2013 version is not bad. And again,
I'm smiling because I'm in the middle of a series called Doctored. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, where I examine clear evidence of them departing radically from scholarly translations and obviously changing the text, either to make the Bible more palatable or to make the Bible fit in more with their doctrines. So
sure,
I'm smirking a little bit, but obviously, we get to agree to disagree on some things.
Well, of course. But it's like I realized a long time ago on religious doctrines. Most of it's based on interpretations of the Bible. And what are interpretations? Well, they're basically opinions, hopefully based on some facts that boil down to just opinions. Let me give you an interesting example. I did some research, must be 25 years ago, extensive research on the basis for the Trinity Doctrine. And of course, 99% of everything written on it is in favor of the Trinity. I have a number of books, very scholarly books written on the Trinity. And one of the ones that someone pointed me to a long time ago was on the notion of, well, I'll show you the title. Okay, it's called Jesus as God. And the scholar who wrote this was an excellent scholar. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone who wants to examine this topic needs to get hold of that book along with some of the other books, the best ones on the Trinity. For example, here's ones I've read recently: Christology of the New Testament, and a biggie, The Triune God. Now this is from real scholars, and they're writing not from a what's the right term? Not from an apologetic point of view, but from their scholarly point of view. And there's a big difference between apologetics, which you'll get from most Trinitarian defenders, and good solid scholars. Now they marshal a tremendous amount of evidence that is quite clear that over a period of time, the Christian church, if you want to call it that, began to teach the Trinity. So the question then becomes, did they was this an evolution, or was this something that came from the very beginning of Christianity? Now that book, Jesus as God, clearly shows by historical material that there was an evolution. For example, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's no trace of an actual Trinity. You could say, maybe an equation of God and Christ, but that's really iffy. But by the time you get to the Gospel of John, it's become much more clear. There's a definite declaration of, I'll call it, the deity of Jesus. And so by a few decades later, it's become stronger. it gets stronger and stronger over the centuries. So there is a demonstrable evolution in the historical reading, the historical writings.
It's kind of what you'd expect from, a book that's compiled by lots of different writers who may have different views, So, my own take is, without having read the books that you've kindly pointed out, my own take is that you can find verses for or against, basically.
Yeah.
And like you were saying earlier, basically just formulate your own interpretation, which isn't, if the Bible is the word of God and there's that much leeway to just come up with multiple different interpretations, it's not been very well communicated, God's thoughts, has it? So,
well, that's exactly the point of this. So yeah. I've come to the point where with discussions on the Trinity and several other things that, even if I was all that interested in it anymore, which I'm not, you can't come to any definite conclusions. You can come to, vague opinions. Of course, that's if you're honest. But unfortunately, most Christians, like young Earth creationists, they are not honest. They like Jehovah's Witnesses, like Watchtower apologists, they're not honest. Because if they were honest, they'd have to admit to some uncertainty about their beliefs, and then their beliefs pretty much go down the drain. And for an awful lot of them, because they've spent a lifetime in some in some religious culture, they're not prepared to make that biggest step, because they'll lose their families, they'll lose their mental equanimity, they'll lose everything.
Alan, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope it's not the last conversation we have on the channel, because I'm sure you have so much more to bring to the table in terms of your perspective. Before we go, how can we find your current body of work? Obviously, there will be links below, but if anyone wants to follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, you obviously have the links, and the name of my website is critiquesonthewatchtower.org. And it's very, very simple website to navigate. So you just, go in it, look at the topics, and dive in
Sure.
somewhere.
Thank you. And yeah, again, links will be there. If anyone's watching this video, perhaps as a Jehovah's Witness on the fence, and they're not really sure as to whether they should kind of go further down the rabbit hole, what would be your advice to them?
I don't quite understand your question.
So if, let's say, a Jehovah's Witness stumbles on our conversation and they are they have doubts which they're carefully concealing, but they feel reticent about exploring those doubts and doing objective research, what would be your message to such a person?
Doubts about doing objective research. Well, basically, I would say do what you can to get rid of your intellectual cowardice. If you want to have discussions, there's any number of resources. I provided an email link on my website. I will answer questions and have discussions. And there's other venues where you can have discussions. Unfortunately, these days there are not any what I will call good venues for back and forth, because, well, people just don't seem to be interested in having those sorts of discussions. Not like we had 20, 25 years ago.
And they're actively dissuaded from having conversations with apostates.
Oh, yeah.
That has something to do with it.
Well, that's where the intellectual cowardice comes in.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience. Again, the work you've done over the years has been a tremendous resource, and I'm sure it will continue to benefit generations to come. So thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome, Lloyd. And by the same token, thank you for all of your work. I have to say, I really enjoy looking at your videos, because they're generally of excellent content, and I don't always agree with you, but so what?
Exactly. We're free to disagree now that we're no longer in a cult.
That's right.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Don't forget that you can watch similar videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.